The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $50, and Delbert Voss laughed loud enough that the pigeons in the rafters of the old farmer's grange lifted off their beams and circled once before settling again. It was the 19th of April, 1986, and the Halloran estate auction had drawn half the county into the drafty hall on the edge of Beeler, Kansas, because the Hallorans had been in that town since before the railroad came through, and everyone wanted a look at what 110 years of living left behind. The thing on the block was a riveted police lockbox, dark green under a skin of rust, about the size of a footlocker but heavier, its lid banded in iron and its face pocked with 4 hand-driven rivets in each corner. There was a mortise lock in the front the size of a man's palm, and the keyhole in the center of that lock had been packed with candle wax a long time ago, hard and yellow and cracked like old amber. The hinges had seized. The handles on each end had been welded flat to the body by someone who did not want them used. On the lid, faint under the rust, you could still read the stenciled letters, Beeler TWP Constable Property Room 3. Somebody had tried to grind that stenciling off once and given up halfway. Charlie Ammon bought it. He was 71 that spring, lean as a fence post, stooped a little from a lifetime of leaning over benches and tumblers, and his hands had the look hands get when a man has spent 50 years handling brass and steel and the small, precise parts inside old locks. His knuckles were swollen. 2 of the fingers on his left hand didn't fully close anymore. He wore a canvas jacket that had been through 3 winters past its last patching, a chambray shirt buttoned to the throat, and a gray work cap that set low over eyes the pale color of well water. He raised his bidding card once at $50, and no one else raised theirs, and the gavel came down. Delbert Voss laughed, because Delbert Voss was the kind of man who laughed at anything he didn't understand. He was 49 years old, ruddy in the face, clean-shaven and heavy through the middle in the way men get when they trade physical work for a desk and a phone. He ran Voss Ag Supply out on the highway, and he wore that day a maroon sport coat over a company polo, a gold chain heavy enough to notice, and a class ring from a school he had not finished. His pickup outside was a new one, a candy red half-ton with the dealer sticker still in the window, and it sat gleaming beside Charlie's blue and rust 1962 Chevrolet like a magazine advertisement parked next to a memory. $50 for a boat anchor, Delbert said loud enough that the whole hall could hear him, and he slapped his knee. Charlie, you gonna sink it or you gonna sit on it? A few men chuckled because Delbert had that way of making other men join in, even when they didn't want to. That thing's welded shut, Charlie. Ain't been opened since Truman. What are you gonna do? Break a saw on it? Charlie did not turn his head. Charlie signed the slip the cashier handed him and folded his copy into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket and asked 2 younger men to help him wheel the lockbox out on a hand truck. He did not answer Delbert. He did not smile. He walked past the man like he walked past a radio playing in another room. What Delbert Voss did not know, and what almost no one at that auction knew, was that on the back edge of the lockbox, low down where the rust had eaten deepest, Charlie Ammon had seen a small maker's mark still just barely legible under his thumbnail. It said, Sargent and Greenleaf, New Britain, Connecticut, 1919. And Charlie knew, because Charlie had spent his life knowing such things, that a Sargent and Greenleaf mortise lock from 1919 was a lever lock of 6 wards, and that, no matter how many decades of wax and weather and welding had gone into hiding it, a lock like that could be opened by a man who understood how it was made. And more than that, Charlie had known Constable Ezra Halloran, who had died in 1948, and Charlie had known that Ezra Halloran was not the thief the town had made him out to be. Charlie Ammon had learned his trade from a man named Orrin Boyd, who ran a locksmith shop out of a converted carriage house on 2nd Street in the years before the war. Orrin Boyd was already old when Charlie came to him in 1931, a 14-year-old boy whose father had died in a grain elevator collapse and whose mother needed the 50 cents a day the apprenticeship paid. Orrin Boyd had said to him one afternoon, standing over a bench with a Yale cylinder spread out in pieces on green felt, "Charlie, a lock is a promise a man made to himself, and a locksmith is the fellow who has to decide whether the promise was worth keeping." You remember that. Charlie had remembered it. He had remembered it for 55 years. He drove the Lockbox home slow, keeping to the shoulder on the county road so the truck would not shake the rusted iron on the bed. His house sat at the end of a lane a mile north of town, a plain white farmhouse with a workshop behind it, where he had done business under a hand-painted sign that read simply, "Ammon, Locks and Repairs." He backed the truck up to the workshop doors and unloaded the lockbox onto a wheeled pallet with the help of a block and tackle he had rigged to a ceiling beam 30 years before. Then he stood in the doorway looking at it for a long time before he turned out the light and went in to supper. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it doesn't. Charlie Ammon had lived his whole life inside that kind of patience, and he had watched men like Delbert Foss come and go, roaring in on the strength of a good year and roaring out again in the wake of a bad one. And he had learned to keep his own counsel. He was not angry at the auction. He was not embarrassed. He had heard laughter before, and he would hear it again, and none of it changed what a lock was, or what a man had done, or what the truth of a thing might be when you took it apart carefully and looked inside. By the following Tuesday, the story had made it all the way to the counter at Merle's Diner, where the coffee was thin and the gossip was thick, and Delbert Voss had told the story of the boat anchor at least 6 times, and improved it each time. By Wednesday, half the men who came in for the breakfast plate were calling the lockbox Charlie's coffin. By Thursday, a boy of 19 named Dale Petrick, who worked the pumps at the Sinclair station and had been apprenticed to Charlie the previous fall for 2 afternoons a week, heard the joke and did not laugh, and drove out to the farmhouse after his shift to see if Charlie needed help. He found Charlie in the workshop with the lockbox up on 2 sawhorses and a shop lamp trained on the face of it. Charlie had already spent 4 evenings on the whack. He had a set of dental picks laid out on a strip of leather, and beside them a small alcohol burner, and beside that a jeweler's loop on a leather thong. He had softened the candle wax a millimeter at a time, with the heat of the alcohol flame held 4 inches off, and lifted it out grain by grain with the picks, because a lever lock from 1919 could be ruined by a chip of hardened wax pushed down into the wards. "Mr. Ammon," Dale said from the doorway, "you want a hand?" "You can sit," Charlie said without looking up. "You can watch. Watching is most of it." Dale sat on an overturned bucket and watched, and after a while Charlie began to talk in the quiet way he talked when he was working, more to the lock than to the boy, but not minding if the boy heard. "Orrin Boyd taught me," Charlie said, "that you do not attack a lock. You listen to it. A lock has been sitting inside itself for a long time. It has settled. You disturb it too fast, and the levers see. You go slow, and the levers remember what they were made to do." He lifted out a curl of amber wax the size of a rice grain and set it on a white index card. Ezra Halloran packed this wax in here himself. In the summer of 1947, I would guess. He was a careful man. He would have used a good candle, beeswax, not paraffin. Paraffin gets brittle. Beeswax stays plastic. That's why we can still get it out. You knew him? Dale asked. I knew him, Charlie said. I was 31 years old the year he died. I set the locks on his back porch and on the door of his tool shed the spring before it happened. He paid me in silver dollars, 4 of them. He had a grip like a vice clamp and eyes that took a long time to trust a man. He did not steal that money, Dale. Whatever they told you, whatever your grandfather told you, he did not steal it. He was too young. His grandfather had been the one who told him not to walk on the north side of the cemetery where Ezra Halloran was buried under a stone with no name, only a date, because a man who died in disgrace did not get his name in the granite. But Dale did not ask. He watched, and he learned, and he went home when Charlie turned off the shop lamp at 9, and he came back the next night and the next. The story of Ezra Halloran was not written down anywhere in Beeler in 1986, but it lived in the mouths of the older townspeople in fragments. He had been constable from 1922 until 1948. He had been a widower after 1935. He had been elected 6 times without opposition. And in the fall of 1947, $11,000 in cash had gone missing from the safe of the First Producers Bank of Beulah after a robbery in which 2 men had been killed, a bank clerk named Wendell Krause and the assistant manager. The robbery had been solved quickly. 2 drifters from Missouri had been caught in Wichita with part of the money, and both had died in a shootout with the sheriff's deputies before they could speak. But $3,000 of the bank's money had never been recovered. And the last person known to have handled the bank's cash on the day of the robbery in his capacity as constable and as the man who had responded first to the alarm had been Ezra Halloran. He had denied it. He had denied it in the newspaper, in the courthouse, on the porch of his own home. He had asked to be investigated. He had opened his accounts to the county auditor. He had found nothing because there was nothing to find, and no one believed him because a man who protests is a man with something to hide. In February of 1948, he was found in his kitchen with a service revolver in his hand and a hole above his right ear, and the note on the table said only, "I did not take it. I know who did. God forgive me for not proving it in time." The town had read the note as a confession dressed up as denial. The town had buried him without honors, and the town had gone on. Charlie Ammon worked on the lock for 11 nights. On the 12th night, which was the first Tuesday in May, with Dale Petrick sitting on his upturned bucket and the shop lamp throwing long shadows across the pegboards on the wall, Charlie fitted a lever pick of his own making into the cleaned mortise. Each one gave with a small sound, and the last gave with a sound like a held breath, finally letting go, and the bolt inside the lockbox slid back 1/4 of an inch and stopped. And Charlie opened his eyes. He did not open the lid. He sat back on his stool and folded his hands in his lap and looked at the lockbox for a full minute without speaking. Dale did not speak either. Then Charlie stood up and washed his hands at the workshop sink with the yellow bar of lye soap he kept there, and dried them on a rag, and came back and lifted the lid. The hinges did not resist. Someone had oiled them from the inside, years and years ago, against just such a day. Under the lid, laid in careful order on a bed of oilcloth, were 3 things. The first was a canvas bank bag, the drawstring rotted, but the cloth still whole, and inside it $3,040 in Federal Reserve notes from the 1934 series, banded in paper bands, stamped First Producers Bank of Beeler, in faded blue ink. The second was a leather portfolio cracked at the spine, and inside it a sheaf of documents in a spidery hand, deposit records, teller sheets, a signed and notarized statement by a man named Harlan Voss, dated the 8th of January, 1948, admitting that he had removed $3,000 from the bank's inner vault on the afternoon of the robbery under the cover of the confusion, and had hidden it in his own cellar with the intention of returning it when the audit passed. The third was a letter, folded twice, in an envelope addressed in a careful pencil, "To whoever opens this, in the hope that a man's name may yet be cleaned." Charlie read the letter aloud, and Dale Petrick listened, and neither of them moved while he read. "My name is Ezra Halloran. I am the constable of Beeler Township. On the afternoon of the 3rd of October, 1947, following the robbery of the First Producers Bank, I entered the vault to secure the premises and found the assistant manager, Emmett Halloran, my cousin. I found also that the inner cash drawer had been opened and its contents disturbed in a manner not consistent with the robber's past. 3 days later, I received the enclosed confession from Harlan Voss, cashier, who came to my home in the night and asked me to hold the money in trust while he made restitution, saying that he could not face his family with the truth. I agreed, against my better judgment, because Harlan was a young man with a young wife and I believed him. He did not make restitution. He left the county in December. I have carried the money and the confession in this box since. If I am reading this, it means I have been unable to clear my name in life. I ask that whoever opens this box deliver the money to the bank and the confession to the county attorney, and that my name be entered again in the record of honest men. I only tried to give a man a chance to be better than he was. Ezra Halloran, the 30th of January, 1948. Dale Petrick was crying quietly, in the way a young man cries when he does not know he is crying. Charlie folded the letter and put it back in its envelope and set the envelope on the oilcloth, and he sat down on his stool and looked at the 3 things in the lockbox. For a long time, he could have kept the money. $3,040 in 1986 was a year's living for a careful old man. He could have burned the letter and burned the confession, and the money would be his and no one would know, because no one had known for 38 years and no one was looking. Ezra Halloran was already buried. Ezra Halloran had been buried a long time. The dead do not know what we do with what they leave behind. Charlie closed the lid and slid the bolt and left the lockbox on the sawhorses, and he walked into the house and made coffee, and he sat at his kitchen table until sunrise. When the sun came up, he took his hat and his coat and drove into Beeler and parked outside the offices of the county attorney, a woman named Louisa Halloran Merritt, who was Ezra Halloran's granddaughter by his only son. She was 52 years old, tired around the eyes, a plain woman in a brown suit, and when Charlie set the leather portfolio on her desk and told her, briefly and without adornment, what was in it and what was in the lockbox in the bed of his truck outside, she sat down very slowly in her chair. Then she asked him to wait, and she called the president of the bank, and she called the sheriff, and she called a reporter from the Beeler Gazette, and by noon there were 6 people in her office and a stenographer taking down every word Charlie said, which was not many. He would not take a reward, He would not take a photograph. He said only, "The lock was made in 1919 by Sargent and Greenleaf. Ezra Halloran packed it with beeswax and welded the handles flat, so the box would not be casually opened. He wanted it opened by a man who understood locks. That is what I do. I bought it at auction for $50. And when Louisa Halloran Merritt tried to thank him, her voice breaking, he put on his hat and said, "Your grandfather shook my hand once. He had a good grip. That is enough. Thanks for me." And he left before she could rise from her chair. The Bieler Gazette ran the story on the front page of its Sunday edition under a headline that said, "Constable Halloran cleared after 38 years. Locksmith's patience unseals the truth." The article named Harlan Voss as the confessed thief. Harlan Voss had died in Oklahoma in 1961, but his surviving family in Bieler read the paper along with everyone else, and one of them was Delbert Voss, who was Harlan's nephew, and who had spent 30 years telling anyone who would listen that his uncle had been a self-made man who left Kansas because Kansas was too small for him. Delbert Voss said very little that week. He said very little the next week either. Voss Ag Supply lost its main seed account by the end of the summer, and by the following spring the business had folded. And by 1989, Delbert had moved south to a town in Oklahoma where nobody knew his uncle's name. He was not run out. Nobody ran him out. He simply found that a town that had once laughed at his jokes did not laugh anymore, and he did not know how to live in a town that did not laugh. The lockbox itself was cleaned and restored by the County Historical Society and set in a glass case in the front room of the old Bieler Township Hall, with a small brass plaque beside it that gave Ezra Halloran's dates and his rank and the words, "His name is here restored." His patience was longer than ours. Beside the box, in a smaller case, was Ezra Halloran's letter under glass, and beside the letter was a card that read, "Opened the 29th of April, 1986, by Charles E. Ammon, locksmith of Bieler." Charlie went to see it once, on a Thursday evening in June, when the hall was almost empty and the light was going yellow through the high window. He stood 10 feet back from the case and looked at the lockbox for a while, and he did not go closer, and he did not touch the glass. Dale Petrick was with him, standing a step behind, and neither of them spoke. After a few minutes, Charlie put his cap back on and turned and walked out to the truck, and they drove home the long way, past the cemetery on the north side, where a new stone had been set a week before with Ezra Halloran's name on it, in fresh-cut granite. He lived 9 more years. He kept the shop open 2 afternoons a week until the end. Dale Petrick took over the business in 1995 and runs it still, in the same converted carriage house Orrin Boyd had used, with the same green felt on the bench and the same hand-painted sign out front. So I'll leave it with you. If you had bought that lockbox for $50 and found $3,000 and a dead man's letter inside it, and known that no one living would ever be able to prove you had found anything at all? Or would you have closed the lid and gone on with your quiet life and let a buried man stay buried?